Ohio State keeps adding to its roster. This time it's a five-star quarterback. That's Jeremy Birmingham. I'm Bill Landis. These are Snap Judgments brought to you by Buyers Auto. Ohio State has added Julian Sayin, like just as we all expected on January, whatever. Ohio State is adding, the consensus top quarterback in the class of 2024 to its roster. Nothing out of the ordinary about that whatsoever. This is college football, and we all love the way that rosters are getting put together these days. How did Ohio State's view on this evolve over, I guess, whatever the time period was from when Julian Saying went into the portal following Nick Saban's retirement to this point now where the Buckeyes have welcomed him into the program?
Yeah, it's funny. I mean, it's not funny, haha. It's funny, because this is what's happening. We're in such a crazy time of college football and roster management and the coaching carousel and the transfer portal that my AirPods have burnt out. So apparently that's why I'm wearing these today. The reality is Ohio State went into Friday morning thinking this was a situation that they didn't need to entertain. It was like, well, we've got Will Howard, we've got Devin Brown, we've got Lincoln Keenholz, you've got Aaron Noland as the incoming freshman. The roster, the alignment was set up the way that they wanted it to be after years of trying to get it back to that because of what happened with the Quinn Ewers thing and how that sort of threw the entire quarterback room for not like a loop from as far as a competitive standpoint or whatever, but like it misaligns the room and forced you to kind of be uncomfortable with having two quarterbacks in the class of 2021 and then having to add Devin Brown late when you didn't really get a full, like, real evaluation of him over the whole year. Then you lose, then CJ Stroud's out of there in 2 years when you weren't sure that he was going to be that great, but then he was greater than great. And so there was a reluctance to just throw another piece into the puzzle because you didn't need to. But what really happened over the last couple of days, between the time Ohio State was unsure about this decision versus sure about this decision, was the conversation that this is Ohio State. And if you're going to win a national championship, if you're going to have a national championship standard, which maybe that's another conversation, whether they should or should not have that standard. I mean, that's fair, I think, considering they've only won 2 in the last 40 years. But I think the question is, how do you say no to the quarterback that you had circled as the best player in the country at that position? How do you say no to upgrading your roster? Because that's what it is. It's an upgrade of the roster no matter what. And how do you say no to that while believing in competition at its core? And it just came down to that. If you want to be the best, you need to bring in the best. And if the best wants to come in, you can't say no.
Yeah, I'm kind of two minds here, and I'm gonna try not to sit on the fence the whole time, but I could see the side of the argument that this is a potentially very disruptive move for Ohio State, and quarterback recruiting and sort of like maintaining the health of that room is already an incredibly difficult challenge, and I think only going to get more difficult. So why sort of invite that? But then the other side of it is like, yes, that's all true. So you better make sure you have guys in your program that you think you can play. So when the guy who is the consensus number 1 quarterback in the class says I want in, even if the timing is odd, and even if you weren't playing or planning on it, I also understand, like, coming around to the idea of, like, you know what, I think we need to do this. So yeah. My lean is the latter. Like I said this when we talked on the Caleb Downs Snap Judgment the other day, that if Ohio State had evaluated Julian Saying as at least as good as Aaron Noland, if not better, then I think you probably need to take him, or I would take him if I were in their shoes. So I'm not surprised that they've come around to this idea, but it is like, now it's a really difficult thing, I think, to manage for Ryan Day. I don't know that it tremendously, or I don't think that it impacts things like in a negative way. It's just, you have to get guys bought into the idea of an insanely competitive environment. And I think on some level, quarterbacks who decide to come to Ohio State are already programmed that way. But this is different. So this requires, I think, a lot of difficult conversations, conversations that perhaps aren't totally dissimilar from the conversations they had to have when they decided to bring Will Howard into the program. But he's a 1-year rental. He does not have much of an effect really on Lincoln Keenholz's timeline, or certainly Aaron Noland's timeline. Now bringing Julian Saying in, who is the same year as Aaron Noland, 1 year behind Lincoln Keenholz, that's a different animal to try to wrap your mind around. And I guess, like, Ohio State has to massage that now moving forward. But, Ryan Day also gets paid $10 million a year to have those uncomfortable conversations and to, keep players apprised of the situation and do what's best for Ohio State in the long run. So I think this is a good thing. I know that you and I maybe have seen this a little differently as it's played out the last couple of days. Like, how do you just like personally feel about it now that it's happening for Ohio State?
Yeah, what I feel about it hasn't really changed. I just don't think it. I understand both sides of it, though, and I think that I don't want to sound like you. Like, I'm not trying to be on both sides of the argument, but I think there is a fair argument on both sides, and the reality is Ohio State wants to be the best program in the country. What's different about this is the timing. If this happened in August and Julian Sayin called and said, "Hey, I want in," Ohio State would have called Aaron Nolan and said, "Hey, this is now happening. We want to give you the opportunity to make yourself aware of this, and how do you proceed from here is up to you." That's what happened with CJ Stroud and Jack Miller. I mean, Jack still came in with CJ in the class and tried to fight it out, and CJ ended up winning that battle. Like, that's totally fine. That happens. It feels more like the Quinn Ewers thing than it does the CJ Stroud thing because of the timing of it. It comes in, it disrupts things in a way that puts people, even CJ Stroud, who was going into 2021, the clear-cut starter in everyone's mind. There was the competition with Kyle McCord, but it really wasn't a competition in 2021. Like, even CJ Stroud mentioned that when Quinn got there, and this is obviously much different, not apples to apples because Quinn got there in August. But it throws off your expectation of everything once you're already there and in the program. And I don't disagree from the perspective of bringing more talent. Like, that is why Caleb Downs is there. Okay. Like, I understand that people will say, how is this different than what happens to Malik Hartford when Caleb Downs comes in? Well, obviously it's different. The quarterback is one guy on the field and you're not rotating quarterbacks. The quarterback's not playing special teams. He doesn't have other ways to contribute. But my perception of it hasn't changed. And I believe probably too much. And maybe I'm too romantic about like the old school culture building and championship, rosters start with love. And maybe that's just me. And I grew up playing sports. I grew up in a family of 11 children. Like, when things were said, when this was the arrangement, if things changed and it became like, hey, that's not cool. But it is a different world now. And Julian Saying is making this decision. And I think this is where, like, I start to lean towards, I get it. Aaron Nolan is at Ohio State. He's been there for 2 weeks. He's working out with the team. He's doing the things he needs to do to get ready. Like, he's got his NIL situation figured out. They know what they're doing. This isn't a situation where, like, they're reaching out to Julian saying, "Hey, buddy, we've got a X amount of money for you. Like, come on, let's do this." This is him saying, "I want to take this shot." This is Julian Saying's family saying, when Nick Saban retired, Ohio State is the place that he needs to be. Like, this was initiated by the family. And so they're not coming in here into this situation with the pretense of, I'm the big swinging D on campus. Okay. Like, this is I'm going to come in and I'm upsetting the apple cart. So I actually think you might get a different like, I'm not going to sit here and talk about or pretend I know every conversation that happened with Quinn Ewers in August of 2021. But I believe firmly that when Quinn got to Ohio State, he was of the mindset that it was going to be easy and that things were going to work out for him. And he was, Quinn Ewers, and he was going to be the starting quarterback before he knew it, et cetera. And then 5 months later, he was gone. This is not that situation. That's a long-winded way of saying I get it. I do get it. I just don't like it. Like, but I don't disagree with it. I just don't like it.
Yeah, you don't. But what you don't like is more of a commentary on college football at large than it is Ohio State specifically.
Yeah, because you have to do it. If you want to beat Georgia, if you want to beat Michigan, you want to beat, like, this is what has to happen. That's what I wrote on Sunday at rivals.com or ohiostate.rivals.com. Like, the obligation for Ryan Day is to put the best players on the field possible for Ohio State. And if that player is Julian Saying and he happens to call a month after signing day, then you got to do it. And I get it. I do believe that the initial instinct from Ryan Day was to say thanks, but no thanks. But again, and this is something we've talked about, and maybe it's a bit of a broken record over these last few weeks, much like my AirPods, is that this is a new Ryan Day. And I think it's just another example of Ryan Day stepping outside of what has made him comfortable in the previous 5 years of his employ at Ohio State and saying, everything's on the table this year. There is nothing that you can hold back. And if the number one quarterback in the country, by your own estimation, and again, Ryan Day, like, quarterback is his thing. If this is the guy he believes is the best QB in the country, how do you say no?
Yeah, that's ultimately where I've come around to, is how do you say no? And I really don't think you should say no. Again, like, if they had said no, I don't think it's the most egregious thing in the world, but I in their shoes would have done what they did and say yes. And I do think it's not easy, but I think it is explainable to Aaron Nolan. Like, for the point that you made, it's like they're not shopping around for quarterbacks because they don't think Aaron Nolan is good enough.
Yeah.
It just so happens that a really good one came to them and said, like, hey, do you have space for me? I want to come compete for the starting job. Like, I don't think, if there's any thought, I guess, among the fan base that doesn't want this to happen, or didn't want this to happen, that Ohio State was looking for an upgrade over Aaron Nolan and is like bringing in Julian Saying and anointing him the program's next starting quarterback before he's ever set foot on campus. Like, that is not my read on this at all. This is Ryan Day making his quarterback room as talented and as competitive as it could possibly be, and then hoping that through that, Ohio State ends up with the best quarterback it could possibly have. And you know what? That quarterback could be Aaron Nolan, because Aaron Nolan's really good. If he and Julian Saying compete throughout this spring, compete throughout next year to be whatever that looks like behind Will Howard, I guess that would depend on what Devin Brown ultimately decides to do, and then go at it again next spring and next summer to try to be this team starting quarterback. I think that's really healthy for Ohio State. And I think the end result is they end up with a very young, albeit, but a quarterback with a tremendously high ceiling, whichever one of the two it ends up being. And I don't know why you would deny yourself that opportunity in the end if it was presented to you. So I get why Ohio State is embracing it now.
Yeah, because fundamentally the conversation with Aaron Nolan is not different than it was 6 months ago. Mm-hmm. It's not different. It's what makes it different is the detail of the timing. The conversation when you recruit Aaron Nolan the first time is, and when he signs, is, this is Ohio State. The best quarterbacks in the country are going to come here, and they're going to compete with you. Maybe initially that is a year from now when Tavian St. Clair, the number 3 ranked quarterback in the country, signs and is starting his journey at Ohio State. But that was no guarantee of that. I mean, it's not. I know that Ohio State didn't sit down with Aaron Nolan and say, we guarantee you there will never be another quarterback in this class. It was probably assumed, rightfully so, especially because, again, here we are a month after signing day. So you would not imagine at that point that it would happen. But because of the extenuating nature of the circumstance with Nick Saban's retirement, like, you can't look a gift horse in the mouth, and that's what this is. It is a free gift of the country's best quarterback to Ohio State, the program that has been better than anybody in the country in the last 7 years at developing quarterbacks. So, seems like it's something you can't say no to. And then when you look at Julian as a player, 6'2", 200 pounds, big arm, like, there's a little bit, I don't know. I mean, I've seen a lot of different comparisons about what you get out of him. He's not the most hyper athletic guy. He's not like a JJ McCarthy, Lincoln Kienholz type of athlete, like that real, like, lanky runner who gets to the sideline quick. But he's got extremely, extremely high level football IQ, exceptionally good in the pocket, making time, creating space in the pocket, like climbing in the pocket. He's your very traditional California quarterback. Like, he gets it. There's a little bit of there's a lot of Bryce Young in his game. But
I thought you were going to say Brett Favre. I was like,
no. No, there's a lot of Bryce Young in his game to me, but he's like legitimately 3 inches taller than Bryce, who's like 5'9". So, you look at the quarterback position and you get used to seeing these 6'4", 6'5" guys. He's just scraping 6'2", but that's not a problem. 6'2" is not short. It's shorter.
Yeah. Right. I think so. I've obviously watched a little bit of him since we last talked about him on the Caleb Downs snap judgment. And the thing, and it's high school highlights, so I try not to make too much of it because they're only kind of showing you the good things. You don't see the bad things. You don't see full games. But one thing that did stick out to me was something you mentioned with him, was like, yes, his athleticism does not necessarily like jump off the video at you, but he did seem to have some good short area quickness to like move around the pocket, to sidestep some stuff, to climb in the pocket, to buy himself some time. As you said, like that to me looked like it was at a pretty, elite level for a kid who is not, well, I guess he's technically a freshman in college because he was enrolled at Alabama, but he's not played a college snap yet. And I think that like pocket feel, I think, is hard to teach too, or at least it's hard to cultivate, I think, in a really young player. And Julian Saying seems like he is coming to college with that, which I think gets you a long way as you're a young player, and you do, got to learn all the ins and outs of the college game and learn an offense and learn more about reading coverages. Obviously, he can make all the throws. He wouldn't be the number one quarterback in the country if he couldn't. But I also thought that there was a little bit of an athletic upside there too that maybe could be tapped into a little more as he continues to develop physically. He had 4 rushing touchdowns in his senior year in 10 games. In Carlsbad, California this past season. He threw 24 touchdowns, only threw 1 interception, which was another thing that jumped out at me. That's a pretty insane touchdown to interception ratio, but there's just a lot of polish there. Same with Aaron Nolan. I think Aaron Nolan's a very polished player too, and won a whole hell of a lot down in Georgia as well. So Ohio State is bringing in now a second young quarterback that I think has a lot of sort of like intangible things clearly, but also physical tools that make you really excited. And also physical tools that I think will be apparent very early on for both of them when they start practicing for Ohio State.
Yeah. I don't know if it's the number 9 that he wears. It reminds me of Bryce Young, and it reminds me of, and I'll say this understanding that people will roll their eyes, but the way he moves in the pocket and throws on the run and can just create time feels a little bit like Joe Burrow to me, the way that he does things. He's very accurate with the football. Doesn't have, like, he's got a big enough arm to make any throw, but he's not relying on throwing a fastball every time he needs to. Like there is a little bit, now he's 2 inches shorter than Joe and 3 inches taller than Bryce. So he's sort of in the middle of them as far as where he's at right now. But I think that there's a combination of those types of traits. He doesn't have, I think that big, bold, charismatic personality that Joe does, and some of what we've seen out of Devin Brown or even Lincoln Keenholz. He's a much more like level, even keeled type of kid. Again, that's that California cool thing. It's just like, hey, it's not going to ever get too up or too down. He's coached by Danny Hernandez out in California, one of the best private quarterback instructors in the country. Like that guy is really good at helping refine quarterbacks. And I think to me, like if you're talking what makes Julian Saying, in my opinion, ahead of Dylan Raiola, ahead of DJ Lagway, the Florida signee, ahead of Aaron Nolan in the list of like what makes this guy, in my mind, the best quarterback in the country in 2024, it's that refinement to me is he's just a little bit more ready to play at the next level than those guys are at this point, I think. Not that he'll play before those guys because Lagway and Raiola are entering into a different situation. But I think that what you get out of him is a much more polished, ready to go version of a high school senior.
Before we wrap up here, what is the Bill O'Brien impact here? Like, is it just a funny coincidence that Bill O'Brien was at Alabama when they first started recruiting Julian Saying, or was there any draw to Ohio State because Bill O'Brien is now on Ohio State staff?
I mean, I don't. The news about Saying wanting to come to Ohio State basically was announced at the same time that Bill O'Brien was announced at Ohio State. So I don't think that it's anything more than a very good coincidence. But it does matter. I mean, I've talked to people around the Saying recruitment who broke down like the relationship he had with Bill O'Brien because Bill O'Brien's who offered him at Alabama and was recruiting him at Alabama until he took the job with the Patriots. And then Tommy Rees, who had been recruiting him very hard for Notre Dame, and Notre Dame was probably the favorite for Saying until Rees left. And then he ended up, looking elsewhere. But it matters. And I think it matters more from the perspective that the conversations that were happening on Friday about do we really need to do this ended up being, I'm not saying influenced by Bill O'Brien, but his voice was heard. And I think that is the professional mindset that you have to have and why you bring in a professional coach like that, someone who's been in the NFL that says, we understand that you have the desire to do right by people and the feelings, but that doesn't matter.
We saw Caden Proctor go to Iowa. So are there any more Alabama players that Ohio State might want to be adding before this is all over?
You know what's interesting? I mean, there's been a lot of buzz since Thursday about Keon Keeley potentially entering the transfer portal, and immediately the buzz was that he was going to end up at Georgia, but that's when everyone assumed Caleb Downs was going to end up at Georgia. I don't know that those two are any sort of package deal or if there's any ongoing conversation between them, but if you look at Ohio State now, and we'll just spin off this for 1 second before really this is a much larger conversation, but the position group that, like, if you look at the roster and you go, this is the one area aside from right tackle, which we've already talked about, but we both believe Luke Montgomery can fill that. Like, who's the guy at linebacker? Who like that? This defense has a chance to be generational, and I don't like to use that term, but the linebacker spot is a hole that needs to be filled. So would Keon Keeley, who Ohio State was recruiting as a 4-3 defensive end, who Alabama was recruiting as a 3-4 outside linebacker, does he have an opportunity? I don't know. We'll see. I'm not going to count on anything. It's late in the process. Kids are Alabama kids can still leave anytime they want for the next couple, weeks. But there are things like getting enrolled in class, and that still people pretend is important.
It's all fake, man. None of it matters anymore. So sorry, go ahead.
No, I mean, it doesn't matter. And I've joked about it before. The NCAA, not consistent at all. They can change their rules whenever they want. It does not matter.
It doesn't matter. What does matter is that Ohio State has added another very talented player to its roster in the 5-star quarterback, Julian Sayin. He's the third player from Alabama that Ohio State has added this offseason. Continues a run of really strong roster plays from Ohio State. And I think even more reason to be excited about where the Buckeyes are going, even if this one is slightly more complicated. I'm sure we'll have more conversation about this, certainly as we get closer to spring ball, but even over the next couple of weeks, even before that. So we'll wrap up this episode here of Stat Judgments. They have been brought to you, by Buyers Auto. That's Jeremy Birmingham. I'm Bill Landis. Thanks so much for watching. We'll talk to you next time.